Prior to the rise of money and markets, another really, and also just still in a lot of societies, even when there is money, a very common form of distribution that humans use, and the third form, other than market exchange and reciprocity, is redistribution. So redistribution is exactly what it sounds like. Redistribution means that you take goods and services, you take stuff, you give it to a leader or to some kind of central authority, and then that gets reallocated back to the group, usually in some kind of different pattern. So we all pool the food together from the hunt that we did, and then we do a very methodical thing where each person gets a portion of it. So for example, in Papua New Guinea, traditionally you had, and to some degree still today, big men or big women who were these charismatic leaders that usually were really good farmers themselves, and then would also get other people to like, hey, everybody, like, give me a bunch of your food so I can throw a party. And then they'd take all the food that they had made because they're hardworking, good farmers, and the other farmers had, hey, give me some of your excess, give me some of your excess, I'm going to do something cool. And then they throw a big party for everybody. And the effect of this is, redistribution, is that everybody gets a fun big party to go to. And then, of course, the side effect for the big woman or the big man is that they get like status from it, right? And they usually become kind of the de facto leaders of a community. And that becomes more exaggerated in places like Tikopia or Hawaii, where you actually had formalized systems of redistribution where the chief was thought of as sort of the spiritual embodiment of deity or the spiritual controller of the land, and therefore people would pool a portion of their resources as tribute to the chiefs, and then the chiefs would lay aside some of that as sort of food storage in case there was a natural disaster. So if there's like a big typhoon or something, the chief is taking a little bit of everybody's food over the year, and then, oh crap, there's a huge typhoon and so, 10 people got their farms wrecked. Well, the chief's got this storehouse of food and he's going to redistribute it to you. So it was this sort of put away for a rainy day kind of thing, and also used for huge feasts, which again, of course, raises the status of the chief. So redistribution oftentimes has the effect of taking a portion of the resources and putting them towards some kind of desired social end, which otherwise wouldn't be met, such as making sure there's food put aside for disasters, or making sure there's huge celebrations, or whatever the case may be. And you tend to see redistribution in societies that have some hierarchies, but not really pronounced hierarchies like what we have in industrialized nations. Another good example of that from British Columbia is the Kwakwaka'wakw potlatch, and of course potlatch is practiced by many Alaska Native tribes as well. However, I want to talk specifically about Kwakwaka'wakw potlatch because it's been studied a lot by anthropologists, because there's some really interesting, unique elements of this specific potlatch. So traditionally within Kwakwaka'wakw potlatch, you kind of have this first entering into European and European Americans people's minds through anthropologists and travelers who reported it kind of around 1900. So you had people like that Franz Boas guy that I talked about before that were writing about this potlatch, and they described this ceremony where people would have, where they would invite another village over, or they'd invite other people to their village, and then the chief would kind of throw this huge ceremony and party where people had like these huge amounts of gifts given to the visiting village, and also would do all these masked dances and masked religious ceremonies where sacred stories would be told. Now, when Boas observed it, they also had some very interesting practices, such as you would have chiefs amass huge piles of blankets, which were used as sort of a form of like trade and currency. Like people would use blankets as a form of debt, like lending them to other people in other villages and then collecting them with interest back. So it was kind of a form of currency and debt. But anyways, the chiefs would amass huge, vast quantities of blankets, presumably by doing well with the debt system and just amassing blankets. And then they would give them away during potlatch. But in some extreme examples observed by some early anthropologists, chiefs would do things like just burn the blankets to the ground in front of the other village, and have kind of like these bragging songs where they would say things like, I'm the greatest chief, and I'm gonna like pour down gifts on your head like molten lava, which is a weird way to refer to gifts, right? I don't know if you ever do that at like a birthday party, like, hey friend, I'm gonna pour down gifts on you like lava to burn your head. That's a weird way to refer to gift behavior. And they would also do things like take valuable copper, carved copper, and break it apart and throw it into the sea. So it was kind of these like really like showy displays of destruction of wealth, which again, if people are just looking out for their own self-interest, doesn't make any sense to make all this stuff you worked hard for the chiefs to take these and just destroy them for no reason. But what was going on, and what we now know through history, from 60 years of history, is that that's not normal behavior for Kwakwaka'wakw societies. Instead, this was something that was happening right around 1900 because there'd been terrible infectious disease epidemics that came from the European colonizers, and things like smallpox that had decimated the Kwakwaka'wakw population. So as a result, you had a bunch of vacant chiefdom positions, like people that were chiefs over villages. That typically would have been something you inherited, but a lot of those positions were now vacant because tragically so many people had died. So in a place where there was kind of a power vacuum in a lot of areas, chiefs were trying to consolidate power over multiple villages, right? Societies tend to sometimes have at least a few power-hungry people, so chiefs were sort of trying to consolidate power, or there were people that kind of like maybe had sort of a tenuous claim to be a chief. Maybe they weren't the direct descendant, but they're sort of the closest thing, and so they were sort of trying to establish their power, and so they were trying to use wealth as displayed through the potlatch as a way of saying like, hey, I'm a really wealthy chief and I'll take care of people, so be my followers, right, and acknowledge me as your chief. And so what's the point of burning blankets or throwing copper into the lake? Well, it's a way of saying, I have so much wealth as a chief, I am so wealthy that I can just destroy wealth, right? That's how much, ridiculously much wealth I have, which is not really all that dissimilar from nowadays when people, quote, make it rain by throwing cash on a group of people, right? What you're doing when you're making it rain is you're saying, I have such a ridiculous amount of money that I can literally just throw money at people. I must have a lot of money. And so it was a way of establishing power. Once that turbulent time was over, the potlatch went back to what it normally was, and what it is indeed for many Alaska Native groups as well, and for many Pacific coastal groups, which is really just a sharing ceremony, not a competitive thing at all, but instead something where one village invites another village, and they share, and they share, and they share to friends and family, and it's usually done for significant events, like a funeral, or like somebody gaining a new status. And then usually there's the expectation that eventually other people will throw a potlatch as well that you'll be invited to. But potlatches are a form of redistribution in the sense that people in a village or in a native group accumulate wealth together, kind of pool it in one person's hands, and then redistribute it as gifts to their guests. Do we have redistribution in the United States? We have market exchange. We definitely know that. That's every time you go to the supermarket. That's every time you go to work. Do we have reciprocity? You betcha. Every time you buy a present or do a solid for your friend and buy him a taco. But do we have redistribution in the U.S.? Do we have something comparable to the potlatch system? Of course, we do among Native groups, but I'm saying more among other groups as well. Do we have redistribution systems? Yes, very, very much so. And there's one that you're very familiar with called taxes. So this is a stupid little meme. We're not sure if the guy threatening me and demanding money is a common criminal or just works for the government. And it's funny because, of course, some people do think that taxation is theft, but generally speaking, when we pay our taxes, we don't think of it as like being mugged or something. But it is a form of redistribution, right? A compulsory form of redistribution where the citizens pay money in the form of taxes. The government then takes those monies and then spends them, and then uses them to provide a variety of different services, such as Medicaid and Medicare, Social Security, so basically shoring up people's retirement accounts. And I'm putting services here when I talk about things like Medicare, for example. Services don't necessarily mean that every single citizen uses them, but that it's something that is given back to the citizenry. So taxes that are collected are used to pay the military, they're used to construct highways, they're used for subsidies for farmers, they're used for school, they're used for food stamp, they're used for police. Anything that involves the government in one way or another has to be at least partially funded by tax revenues. Almost always. There's kind of exceptions that we can think of, but for the most part, it's all tax funded, which is a form of redistribution. Which is why, when we have these debates about sort of like, well, should we socialize healthcare, different things, as an anthropologist, you kind of sit back and you look at that and you say, well, I'm not going to take a position on if that would be a good idea or a bad idea. It is interesting, though, how we frame that issue, because it's interesting where we draw the line of what we call socialized, right? In a sense, we've had socialized, for example, We've had socialized roads for a very, very long time, right? In the sense that we give our money to the government and then the government provides a road. So in a sense, we deal with socialized industries all the time. It's just some of them we call socialized and some of them we don't, because there's ones that we're not used to not thinking of them as redistribution, right? Nobody thinks about roads as something where you would like pay a private road company and they'd like make a road just for you. Instead, we're used to thinking of roads as something that happens through redistribution, and therefore we don't call it socialized roads. We just call it roads. So all of this discussion about distribution of reciprocity to say that wealth disparities, for one thing, are not necessarily inevitable, and nor, for that matter, is the idea of currency and money. That's a certain kind of system that we've set up, and that doesn't make it a good or a bad system. It just makes it a system that we've set up, right? And that's kind of the point I wanted to make there. Now, I finally wanted to conclude. We talked about production, we talked about distribution. I want to kind of talk now about consumption. And so again, much of the idea of how we sometimes think about human behavior is that we just love to consume stuff, right? And that's, of course, certainly what our ads are based on, is the idea that humans love to consume stuff. And yet, this is kind of a funny sign that's saying material possessions won't make you happy, or maybe they will. And yet one of the things that we notice is that consumption itself is sort of culturally driven, in the sense that to some degree what we consume is rooted in culture. It's not just as simple as sort of humans buy what they need, because of course we buy all sorts of things that we don't strictly speaking need, or at least the sense that we need it is sort of culturally shaped. A good example is clothing. We very often buy clothing far more rapidly than the clothing actually deteriorates. Instead, we buy clothing in part based on different fashion trends over time, right? I can't wear this shirt. This was from 10 years ago, and it makes me look like an idiot. But the shirt is still perfectly functional. If the purpose of clothing is just to stop you from being naked and keep you warm, then we would never do that. But of course, fashion trends change, and therefore clothes change. And people buy new clothes often long before they've run out of clothing. And by the way, that of course helps clothing companies who would like to continue to sell you clothing. And we sometimes, we would call that hegemonic, in the sense that it's just sort of a taken for granted assumption that clothing changes styles over time, but really there's no absolute reason why styles of clothing should change. Another good example of the fact that consumption is culturally patterned is conspicuous consumption. So we talked before about a very specific time period where blankets were intentionally burned when chiefs were trying to gain control in certain villages in British Columbia. But we can think of millions of other examples, right? The absurdly wealthy people in this picture, do they really need chandeliers? Is there really any point to a chandelier other than just being shiny and saying, look, we have a lot of money to spend on a chandelier? We oftentimes consume things almost with the sole purpose of showing off the fact that we can consume things, right? That we have money to consume things, because that's tied in with hierarchies, and that's tied in with, I'm going to establish what social position I have vis-a-vis other people. We're sending messages. It's similar to the fact that you can get, potentially a very similar quality product from a generic and a brand name, right? Whether that's food or clothing. It depends. Sometimes the brand name is better, but a lot of times there's plenty of times where it's not, and yet people will buy the brand name clothing partly because of the brand name, right? Because they want to show off that they can buy a certain kind of clothing. And so this kind of just reiterates that concept. We dress certain ways to establish certain identities, to say that I'm a hippie, or I'm a hipster, or I'm a million other social identities that you can identify with. We use clothing to send messages about who we are and who we want people to perceive that we are. So consumption is about a lot more than just what we need. It's also about what we're trying to say to other human beings. So all of these issues, production, distribution, consumption, different cultures have different ways of answering them. And there's consequences of that, right? So for example, there's consequences to having a really strongly fossil fuel-based economy. And I would argue both good consequences and hard consequences. Good consequences in the sense that it's a very cheap form of energy that does a lot of incredible things, right? I'm very grateful when I get into my car that my car can drive me all the way to Anchorage. At the same time, most scientists would bring up the point of climate change and the effect that can have. The forms of distribution that we have, the type of capitalist economy that we have in the US is really good for certain kinds of things, such as market innovation, right? There's a reason that certain amazing types of technology and medicine come out of the United States and other industrialized nations. At the same time, we have a system where there's a lot of people that go without homes, and we for that matter, globally, right? Let's take it away from the US. Globally, we have a system where there's really enough food being produced for every human being, but in some countries you have, for example, warlords, right? In certain types of nations, or civil wars going on, which means that, places like Yemen, where then people aren't getting the food that they need. So it's not really a matter of just growing enough food, it's a matter of getting food to the right people, which politics gets in the way of that. Consumption, right? We decide that we need a camera and a computer attached to our phone, and now we have these things called smartphones, which smartphones are absolutely incredible in terms of how they can allow us to film things and how they can allow us to constantly have access to information and how they can allow us to keep in touch with people. And at the same time, smartphones rely a lot on heavy earth metal or rare earth metals, which, until we develop better technology, rare earth mining tends to be pretty environmentally destructive. And so all of these to say that there's both pros and cons to the economic choices we make, but the anthropology shows us that to some degree they are choices, right? They're choices rooted in culture, that cultures can go different directions and have gone different directions historically. We are not just Homo economicus. We're not just, human beings set down in this market, always looking after only our own self-interest. Instead, we're these complicated, complex, confusing people that do what we do for all sorts of different reasons, sometimes for ourselves, sometimes for others, sometimes for religion, for all sorts of different reasons.